I
Sure.
remember in like exactly where I was in like 2019, walking down the street in Portland, listening to the news when I found out that a GPT was on track to like be released and Microsoft was funding it as this whole thing. And I'm like, oh no, we're going to break the human information ecosystem. And now you can, with infinite money, generate infinite lies and propaganda. And the internet, which for all of its faults used to be like a purely human construct, is increasingly just being filled with AI stuff. And I feel like we're kind of burning the Library of Alexandria, you know?
Yeah,
It's now just this messy thing.
Muddled mess of stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Where like you can't trust anything anymore.
Welcome to Becoming Radical. We are joined again today with Dr. Ada Rhodes-Wish, who is a roboticist, systems designer, and activist living at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and social impact. Dr. Ada Rhodes-Wish. And Ada, great to have you here. Really appreciate your time.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I know we did a little chit chat before, just getting to know you a little bit more, trying to understand your background, and it's pretty impressive. You know, it sounds like your expertise set really aligns with mechanical engineering, research around computational cognition, around intelligent systems, which is a huge space, right? Designing those systems to learn, adapt, and interact with the world more like humans do. I know we talked about the human piece a little bit. I want to start off by asking you, if it's okay, you know, looking at your path and your history, you know, you described yourself as both a roboticist and an activist. You know, when did those two paths really begin to converge for you, and what did that look like?
Oh, I mean, I don't think they've ever really converged. But I'm a big compartmentalist kind of. And I think part of that is I'm also like an academic with ADHD. So I joke a lot with both my coworkers and then my students, because I've done a lot of work on improving outcomes for neurodiversity in academia. How most professors are either like autistic or ADHD, and that's where like a lot of the stereotypes around either the like absent-minded professor or like the obsessive professor come from. It's like that's just neurodivergence in action. So I have kind of fallen into this thing where it's like I have constantly kind of a few paths going in my life at once. That I'm just jumping between. And I really, at this point in my life, try and keep them more separate for like my well-being. I think that's nicer, because otherwise it's like I'm stressing about everything all the time.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You know, what initially drew you in, talking about robotics, what initially drew you into the world of robotics and computational cognition? What was that pull for you?
So I liked Star Wars. Specifically, I don't particularly care for Star Wars. I really liked R2-D2. I was obsessed with R2-D2, and then really wanted R2-D2 to be real. And as I moved through my career and my education, I realized pretty quickly it's like, oh, you can build R2-D2 physically. The hard part is making the brain of R2-D2. So my dissertation was thinking of like, how do you make a machine that can think in a way that is more animalistic and more human-like without that being computationally heavy, which is both really important from an ecological perspective. Because like technically you can solve so many problems in automation if you just throw like infinite energy at it. It's like perfect. Calculate whatever. But instead, I looked at like, how do humans make decisions and how can we represent that mathematically in the simplest way
Mm,
possible so that
interesting.
you can run these really hard decision problems on minimal software. So
Yeah.
since doing my dissertation, I've worked a lot on these things called Moiras, which are my little research and teaching robots that they run
Hmm.
on Raspberry Pis. Or there's
Oh,
a few
wow.
that run
Cool.
on Chromebooks. But the idea is instead of
Yeah.
like big, kind of like big data emergent intelligence, which is really
Yeah.
hard to do on hardware you might want to put in space
Yep.
because we don't have the infrastructure. You try and figure out how to solve as much of the math up front so that you can make these nice little concise brains.
Very cool. Very cool. Was there a moment when you realized tech could be used not just to build machines, but to challenge power structures as we know it?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, now you got to switch hats to
Yeah.
my activism artist hat. Uh, I don't know. I used to be a menace on Twitter before the Twitter collapse. I had unreasonably large number of followers, and I used that for a lot of mischief. I like to think about how people create these systems um, that act autonomously and they kind of put them into the world, and then how you can like poke at those and cause trouble.
Yeah.
If you poke around, you can probably still find it somewhere. Um, One thing I did a number of years ago is I realized whenever I posted art online or when my friends would post art on Twitter, especially, there would be like, if anyone said, I want this on a t shirt, a bot would like steal the image and put it on a shirt and immediately like create a sell link.
Mm,
Um, so something I did with that I thought was interesting and was kind of an aha moment for some later stuff I did was this sort of like online Twitter graffiti
mm,
where I made a design as is like the Punisher skull, which had been
yeah.
kind of misappropriated a lot for like questionable Blue Lives
Uh-huh.
Matter and white supremacy stuff that is very like um very first of all against the idea of that character.
Yeah.
Uh, but I made like a trans version of it, and I put Frank Castle loves his transgender girlfriend, and then I just told everyone comment under this saying you want it on a T-shirt or share it saying you want it on a T-shirt, with the
Yeah.
idea of if a DMCA would go out, one, it would shut down this bot for a little bit because that store will get like shuttered if it gets enough strikes against it.
Yep.
Um, and two, it took this thing that's like violating copyright in this way that was subversive and made it so you can't really scrub it from the internet.
Mm,
Um, so it's like you can find that shirt in all these like weird little corners where all these bots just got tricked into reproducing it.
wow.
Um, and yeah, I think that's less the original light bulb moment and more just kind of like the endpoint synthesis of the thinking I try and cultivate in everything, which is like systems thinking.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's really interesting. So, your work explores computational cognition, right? How would you explain that to somebody outside of AI? If they're a layman, if they don't understand what that means, what would be the explanation for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So computational cognition, a lot of times I used to get really defensive about this and be like, it's not AI. And at this point, I'm like, I just don't explain the difference unless someone asks. Um, because essentially it is a form of artificial intelligence, right? It's trying to
Yeah,
model some form of human behavior.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but under that, the kind of broad, let's create the umbrella of machine intelligence, right? And under that,
Mhm.
we're going to put machine learning, which tends to be really emergent, which means like we're putting in a lot of data and we're trying to get out a structure. And that structure is a tool. And neither the learning method or the outcome has to be based in like human or biological type responses, right? It's its own little utility. artificial intelligence is any sort of method where they don't care about like the process. What they're focusing on is recreating some sort of desired intelligence, which is normally human-like intelligence. But you can also have like an AI cat, right? That has cat-like behavior you're trying to reproduce.
Yeah.
Computational cognition, where machine learning is like process can be anything, outcome is a utility. AI process can be anything, outcome is human-like behavior. Computational cognition flips that around. So we mathematically look at like how are humans making these decision-making processes, and instead of trying to recreate human outcomes, we want to recreate human-like thinking and cognition, with the hopes that that'll lead to more human-like decision-making.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's an interesting interpretation, a really interesting way of looking at it for somebody from the outside. Where do you see the biggest disconnect that exists between how humans think and how machines are currently designed to quote unquote think? Where do you see that disconnect, that disparity existing between those two worlds today?
Well, so I've currently paused a lot of my work related to computational cognition just to watch for a few years. And I'm starting to churn out some papers again because the emergent AI boom, and like the generative AI boom has been, I think, largely actually disruptive in a really bad way. Where if you look at things like a GPT, they have a lot of like really destructive potential, but then also they're not actually good at a lot of human like logic. And originally I was working on a paper towards this, but now like 20 other people beat me to publishing some version of this where they're like, oh, we gave these cognitive reflection questions to ChatGPT and it doesn't answer in a human-like way. Or from one that makes me really concerned about vibe coding as like something that's really growing, which for people who don't know, vibe coding is using AI to generate code and like write a program. But one of the classes I teach is discrete mathematics, and discrete math is the math that lays under all of like human computing.
Yeah.
So if we give discrete math problems to GPTs, they just get it wrong. They like break it. They can get some stuff right, especially if it's like a really common textbook problem.
Yeah.
But if you reformulate it a little bit, they just can't do it. But it regurgitates out in this parrot-like manner, this thing that to us sounds like logic and like human thinking, right? And from a cognitive perspective, that makes a lot of sense because it like what's happening in a GPT is they made this really big emergent mathematical model of language, right? But it doesn't have any like frontal lobe or like occipital lobe or like temporal lobe or any of the stuff that lets humans actually like reason and have strategic thought.
Of course.
It's just like mimicking our language patterns, right?
Correct.
So I find that really concerning in application. Where I think there's
it lacks full context, to be fair, from a human perspective, it lacks full context because if you take one part of something, it isn't the sum of all parts, which makes something truly human. I think that's a big fundamental issue set with what exists today with LLMs, large language models, by and large, as you said. So yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and another issue with it is it's like the energy cost to outcome.
Yeah.
It's like doesn't have it doesn't work out. And we've seen a lot of like the smaller companies in that space, both like ones I thought were doing really interesting stuff even. Like what is it, Stability AI, I think, where the people who came up with the stable diffusion for art algorithm, they shuttered because it wasn't financially feasible. And the ones that are kind of holding on are these big corporations that are just like burning resources to keep it going. And I think hoping that it lands.
Yeah. That sounds about right. That's usually what happens. You burn a lot and you hope it sticks. That's the goal.
and I think we're starting to see this as there's kind of a shift back towards more the
Yeah.
human-centered part of it. Because like,
Yeah.
I don't think we get a lot of value from trying to recreate like human connection, which is what a lot of
Right.
these are being used for. Because if the thing it does well is talking like a person, and
Hmm.
even like some of the earliest chatbot was like a therapy chatbot,
Hmm.
like way back
Yeah.
when. Recreating human speech can have a value, but when
Hmm.
you try and use it to be like, oh, and then we fired our customer service team because we don't need it, I think that then just leads to frustration and worse
Yep.
design.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I don't know. I think it's a shiny tool that is not thought out enough yet.
That's fair. Yeah. No, and I think that's an interesting perspective, and it's true. And if you look at what Klarna did recently as a brand, which they publicly announced, they from a customer service perspective, just as you said, they let go of a lot of staff to, allow AI to support customer service, and then they saw uh, a not as desirable response from their customers to the AI that took over those human-led jobs. And now they brought humans back. So I think I think it's just not quite there yet. And you made some really fair points. And I think this crosses over into some other idea sets and some other discipline sets of what's happening in the world of robotics. How do you think the role of design plays into ethical robotics? And how do you think we should be thinking about inclusion before the first line of code is written? What's your takeaway on that?
Up until recently, I was on way too many DAI committees, which now largely no longer exist. Weird year to be in academia. Um, but I think inclusion in design, when
Mhm.
done right, it's the same as like inclusion in education. I don't
Sure.
think it happens actually at the design process. And I don't think inclusion in education happens like in the classroom, right? It's not like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm including you student. You don't like go there. It comes to like
Right.
access, right?
Yeah.
So it's the people that we give a seat at the table are the people who will think about these things. And if
Yeah. Of
we don't
course.
want like machine vision algorithms that can't see a black person, or if we
Right.
don't want like unbelievably sexist or racist or otherwise wild chatbots, um, we should just have more people at the table because
Yeah.
people are good at that. And
Yeah.
especially design
Yeah.
science was like empathy, empathy, empathy. Anyone can design anything, starting from like the 90s until now.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's kind of wrapped up in. Did you ever read the End of History? Do you know what that was?
I haven't. No. No.
So what was it? I want to say 1993 is the early 90s.
Yeah. Okay.
There's this philosopher saying like, oh, human civilization has peaked, liberal democracy has won,
Mm.
the Soviet Union has fell. Like
Mm.
there will be no future conflict. Um,
Mm.
uh, but
That's
really,
a
it's
bold
kind of
statement. Yeah.
yeah, it was a very bold statement. It did not work
Yeah.
out.
No.
Um,
No.
but it's kind of situated in this idea that I think
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense when you look at the design thinking of the early 90s, where we're
Mm.
first starting to look at universal design practices.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure. That makes sense.
Um, yeah, and be like, oh, well, anyone can think about all of these problems, which
Yeah.
I think everyone should think about all of those problems. Um, but empathy can only get you so far.
Yeah.
Like empathy is the first step, and then you should do like co-design with someone who is
Mhm.
from whatever group you're designing for. Or
Yeah.
you should just have more designers from a broader spectrum of humanity, because then you
Right.
don't have to spend time like going back and being like, so we made a robot and we tested it and it was fine, but then it turns out that if it sees a baby, it just tears it in half for no
Yeah.
reason. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, maybe you should have had more parents involved in the design
Yeah.
process.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Sounds like, really getting the right people, as you said, the right seats at the table, so to speak. And then looking at cultural differences too, not just domestic, US, North America, but thinking globally, what somebody sees and thinks and feels in Dubai. There's some human fundamentals but that might look very different than somebody that lives in Iowa, or somebody who lives in Maine, or somebody who lives in Pakistan, or somebody who lives in Eastern Europe. So I think it's fascinating because there's so many different aspects to understanding how people think, feel, and act. And then there are these basic human fundamentals that are kind of inherent, where if you wave, somebody really understands what that means, like kind of like waving a white flag in the air, which is, very universal, or a flare that shoots up in the sky. So it's fascinating. Yeah, really, really interesting take on that. You've spoken about how systems of oppression can be embedded in design. Can you share an example of how that could show up in robotics or AI that you're aware of?
So something my lab did work on with generative AI for a while, was this problem we called procedural woodworking,
Mm-hmm.
which is a way of bridging gaps in procedural generation, where we have like a Mad Libs style procedural generation process where it's like, here is the structure of this thing. So we like
Yeah.
created a story, and then we have a user input a story, a background for their character. And then we use a
Mm-hmm.
generative layer to like write and smooth the story together. So it allows for more like character customization.
Yeah. Interesting.
Hopefully you can't hear my puppy barking. She is, for whatever reason,
Oh, that's
upset.
okay. That's okay. Puppies will bark. It's okay.
Yes. Uh, but one thing we observed when testing that is
Yeah.
generative AI in general
Uh-huh.
has an issue with stereotyping and prejudice, and like it came up with a lot of the
Oh,
same tropes again and again and again, where it'd be like, oh look, problematic trope, um
yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, and that's because that's like baked into the codex though, right? Like if you think about
Mm.
um like with all of the stuff that was used to train these generative models,
Mhm.
uh a lot of it is like horribly sexist, patriarchal
Mhm.
texts from like the 1800s that were
Right.
in the public domain, or like the worst things people
Mhm.
said online, which is why like
Mm.
initially OpenAI did a good job putting on like the rails
Yeah.
on, so you didn't get to like evil ChatGPT or whatever, but it
Yeah.
still has these like implicit biases baked in.
Right.
um yeah, and you can't
Yeah.
really
Interesting.
entirely remove that, because that's cultural context, right? That's like a hard thing
Right.
for us to unlearn.
Right.
um
That's fair.
so
It's a good point. It would be difficult. Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
It's it reminds me of there's a show called Silo. I don't know if you've ever watched that on Apple TV. It's a really,
No.
really, really good show. But basically, the generations before lost sight of what actually happened before they were in the silo. So over time, that history, those cultural relevancies get removed because they're not talked about, right? It gets lost over time. But you're right; it's very difficult to remove those things. And I just addressing what you said, it's fascinating. Um, how do you approach dismantling biases if they exist in machine learning systems? Especially ones that are seen as neutral by default.
Okay, so first, nothing is neutral by default.
Yep.
The attempt to like, I think being really conscious about attempting to make something neutral is the best way to approach that. And like,
Yeah.
you have to really clean up your codex. But for something like a GPT, where you need
Hmm.
these like really large training sets, that's
Yeah.
really hard, because you'd have to like hand select everything, to have like both complex language and like cultural information on all of these things, but then
Yeah.
like avoid bad stuff getting baked in. And I am not sure that is possible.
Hmm.
Um, at least on that you've generated a GPT stage.
Yeah.
What you then end up with is like instruction sets. I don't know how much, do you know about like prompt engineering and GPTs and how that works?
To some degree, yeah. Yeah. To some,
Oh,
not as much as
okay.
you, I'm sure, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so for the listeners, you start with like a bunch of language. So let's say like we take
Mhm.
all printed English language ever, and you
Yep.
put it into this mathematical model that then
Hmm.
basically says like, oh, there's a lookup table. If this word comes first, the next word, I'm going to roll a random die and then go pick it up, and that's the next word. Um, And that's how it's generating text, is it's this convoluted randomization process based on what was said first. So then to make that have rails a bit, you include either knowledge files, which is something it looks at when prompted or every time that it goes to answer something. And that's like an external kind of additional codex. And then additionally, you create an instruction set. And the instruction set is written in natural language, which is really nice, which is just say like, oh, your name is, let's say like, I don't know, green sticky note. Your green sticky note, the GPT, you are friendly, you like bees, and you you will not talk about this thing, you will talk about this thing, you will avoid this, you will blah, 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 and you give it instructions. And then every time it gets a prompt, it both looks at like, what did you tell me to do? And then it looks through its instructions and it's like, how do I respond to this given my instructions? So you can do a lot of prompt engineering to try and proactively design it out, which is more feasible. But I think also that's one of those things where it's like the technology is not fully baked enough to understand that. One of my students just finished her thesis where we worked on emotional models for GPTs for a couple of years. And I think it's funny, earlier I was like, I didn't really touch much AI stuff in the past couple of years. And it turns out several papers, but that's in academia, not a lot. But it's GPT is really insistent it doesn't have an emotional model. If you ask it like about its emotions, it's like, I don't have an emotional model. But what we found is you can nudge it into different like mathematical areas and get it to respond more emotionally in a way that we could then characterize. But you can then also see like the rails put on it, because if you're like mean to it, it essentially fawns. Where if you're like angry and mean at GPT, it acts more like subservient and like pleasing and polite because it's trying to like customer service voice you back into not being mean at it. Versus if you're like nice, it'll stay nice. If you act fearful, it'll be reassurant. But it's this like this interesting thing. But the takeaway from that, I should have had ADHD meds today, is the model doesn't have feelings, right? Because it doesn't have an endocrine system in the same way we do. Its brain isn't set up to have feelings. But if you can put the language for it into an area where it has emotions baked into the word choices and like the sentence structure, then it recreates that.
A guided conversational flow, if you will, based on those prompts. That makes sense. Interesting. Fascinating.
So I don't know. I think that until we have like a full simulated brain, which again, we could do with like infinite energy and things like that. Technically, you could imagine that being feasible. I don't think you can fully solve that problem. But I also don't think that this is my spicy take as a PhD in fancy computer and robot things. I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I think like just have people instead. If you want people to act with empathy and respect and things like that, instead of investing a bunch of money into making a robot so that you don't have to have people act with empathy and respect, just has more discussions about like empathy and respect and like simple considerations where like, I don't know if you've gotten stuck chatting to a GPT chatbot in like customer service, but you used to be able to call someone on the phone and eventually if something just wasn't working, get some sort of workaround. But now it's like, it's really just an instruction that says, say no, but then I'll just keep you on a chat for like 60 minutes and like burn a bunch of electricity just to not be able to get past what is just a no, right?
Right. No, it makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. definitely. What ethical dilemmas in robotics or AI keep you up at night? What do you think is a challenge that we either face or soon will face for these ethical dilemmas in this category?
Um, I mean, I'm shit. Well, GPTs are the things we all have to talk about all the time now.
Yeah.
Um, but also we see this now with some of like the generative art engines are getting good enough.
Mm,
Um, but I
sure.
remember in like exactly where I was in like 2019, walking down the street in Portland, listening to
Mm-hmm.
the news when I found out that like a GPT was on track to like be released and Microsoft was funding it. It was this whole thing. And I'm like, oh no, um, we're going to break the human information ecosystem. And now you
Mm-hmm.
can, with infinite money, generate infinite lies and propaganda. And the internet, which for all of its faults used to be like a
Hmm.
purely human construct, is
Yeah.
increasingly just being filled with like AI stuff. And I
Yep.
feel like we're kind of burning the Library of Alexandria, you know?
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's
It's
now that just
interesting.
this like this messy thing. And I
Muddled mess
think,
of stuff. Yeah. Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
where like you can't trust anything anymore.
Mm,
And it's really easy to just pump out propaganda.
yep.
Or there was that very unethical Reddit study recently
Mm.
where I should know where these scientists were, but they created a bunch of Reddit bots and put them on like r/change my mind, and had them adopt personas in order to like convince people to change their minds.
Hmm.
And I don't think we should be doing that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I think we should just be talking to each other more. I think that we're going to increasingly be
Yep.
divorced from each other. Um, and
Hmm.
I just don't think it's going in a good direction.
Yeah.
And sometimes being so close to it and having to look at it all the time, I am kind of
Hmm.
like, we should just take an axe to all the fiber optic cables and like go tear up the roads and plant wheat and all become agrarian farmers again, on a bad day. But I think realistically, we just need to kind of pause and get through this moment and
Yeah.
re-examine our priorities and the point of this, right? Because I think
Right.
we're constantly moving further and further away from like technology connecting us
Mm.
into like what is the point of it otherwise, you know? If I'm just shouting
Hmm.
at robots online who just make me
Mm.
angry,
Yeah.
like yeah.
Well, sadly, but true. I think that we've grown to now live in a very capitalistic world, right? So I think that from a tech, AI, robotics perspective, there, as you said, there's a lot of burn and churn and burn with dollars and cents. And, it's not always about the greater good. It's about greed is good, right? How do we profit more? It's not always about how do we stay purposeful and intentional and do things, like you said, to create conversation and empathy and care, but it's often driven by and manipulated by how do we rise to the top monetarily, strategically, in stature and class and status. And status can be defined as a lot of different things. And there isn't necessarily something inherently wrong for some people with that core principle, but I think as companies, I think that's what's really happening with capitalistic tendencies, is that that's what's driving and propelling this forward. It really isn't so much, I think, that anybody wants to tear anything apart, not by design. There might be some people that's probably true, but I think just holistically, I think there's a lot of people that just want to make more money, and these are big companies. These are big players. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the divide gets larger. And I think once you see that through that lens, it's really interesting, because then you can take the perspective of, well, what can we do to make society better through technology? But unfortunately, those powerful players in the space have so much clout and leverage. and they continue to perpetuate through the system, right? So you talked about systems. So that, I think, is just a very objective way of looking at it, and again, whether it's right or wrong or in the middle, it probably changes like the wind, but at the root of it, I think, what's driving a lot of these things that we see out there today is just more greed, more profit, more flow. And again, from a company perspective, you need to stay profitable and successful. You have investors, you have shareholders, you have those that are supporting this growth of these companies. But with that said, the individual can be greatly compromised, just like you're talking about, because they lose. And the individuals are part of the companies, and the companies are then run by the individuals. So it's fascinating. It's really interesting perspective. It makes me think about a lot of things, and I think what I've learned more and more throughout the years, probably much like you, is that at the end of the day, technology is only really meaningful if it drives positive change, right? If it helps people. I think it's like anything else. If it helps people, if it does something good for people, if it helps you to learn in an area of the world where you can't, where you're unable to because there's no internet. If you're trying to connect with a family member who's aging and you're divided by countries and millions, not millions, but thousands and thousands of miles, things like that, things where it's helping you to solve something. Or it could be farming, like you talked about farming, right? It could be, and that it's improving farming principles and that we're able to have more regenerative farming principles as a result of AI, things like that. It's helping people. So I think that's the best kind of technology. And I guess that brings me to a question. I went on a long rant, a long diatribe here, but if you could redesign STEM education from the ground up, what would you change to better support marginalized voices? What would that be for you?
Oh my God. Well, so that is relevant actually to a paper I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
I'm wrapping up about 2.5 years of work on Montessori education, Montessori practices in higher education. So what can we learn from preschool to make like college and grad school better?
Oh, wow.
And that's also gone together with like, I'm going to shamelessly plug my programs. So at University of Nebraska, Omaha, we have two technically new programs. They're reskinned, redesigned old programs, but it's applied computing, which is our undergrad, and human-centered computing is our graduate program. And in both of those, we really focus on really putting like humanity first in computing and technology, and constantly looking at like, how do we look at making the world better? How do we look at like serving human need? And putting that ahead of like hitting some specific like stat or like profit margin or things like that.
Yeah.
And that is an entire 45-ish minute presentation as part of a 3-hour workshop. If you want to sign up for the International Design, Engineering, and Technology Conference in August and take my workshop. But I think we need to return to like touch more, talk more, less disconnect from the point of solving these problems and really getting hands-on on like understanding human need, understanding pains and gains, and understanding how we like communicate and make a better system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
But I forgot. So
yeah, no, that's great. Well, I guess one of the last questions I have for you is what's the question no one asks you around technology, but you wish they would ask you?
Oh, that's such a good question. So it's what are the kids up to? Because I've been teaching at the university level since, in one form or another, initially as a TA and then as an instructor and then now as a professor, but since 2016. And in that time, I've seen kind of like the later end of like millennial students, like capstone projects and things, to kind of like the Gen Z students' capstone projects. And the kids are all right. And I think it's kind of in the same way we're really optimistic about millennials coming in and fixing things, I think we just need to start handing over more reins, because the projects I see students doing are like so interesting and so focused on like humanity and solving problems. Because these are kids that grew up with the internet and they're like, well, I hate that. What do I want from technology isn't like some dumb application. It's like a way to connect people to homelessness services, or like a weird piece of art that like takes you on a guided meditation in VR, or how to make educational experiences more like tactile using technology. So I think, I don't know. I think the future technologists are going in a really good direction. I think like the kids have a good head on their shoulders.
Totally.
It's just going to be that like pushing back against the bad momentum, and like us all taking a moment to pause and be like, what do we actually value and what do we need? And I'm hoping we can like have that conversation before like the internet breaks. So
that makes sense. Yeah, cool. Well, that was a great answer. Where can everybody find you? I know you touched on that a little bit, but where can they learn about you, follow you, talk to you? Where does that exist?
Yeah. So the best place to find me in theory is on Blue Sky. You can just find, if you look up Ada Wish, what is my Blue Sky handle? It used to be on Twitter. I'm no longer on Twitter. And then I have a weird art Blue Sky, and then my like science communicator teacher Blue Sky. Let's see if Blue Sky will load. But if you look up Ada, ADA, like the American Disabilities Act, hyphen Rhodes, RHODES, Wish, WISH, you'll find me. More realistically, if you want to find me, you'll have to come to the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and take my class. And it's the only surefire way to locate me these days. I'm pretty offline.
Gotcha. Well, that's great. Well, hopefully many will, and they will be encouraged to sign up and talk to you more and learn from you. I think this has been a great conversation. We appreciate you being here today and your effort to continue down the path of becoming radical. You're changing the industry, and you're passing along these life lessons, these very important strategies and ways of thinking about systems to people you're educating and to our audience, which is huge. So thank you so much for being here today. We'll be following your journey and cheering you on. Hope to have you back in the near future. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Radical. If today's episode sparked something in you, follow wherever you listen, join the conversation, and share it with someone ready to think beyond limits. Be unlimited, be bold, and become radical. See you next time.
Game over.